Samantha, welcome to the Compete Everyday podcast.
Thanks for having me, Jake. Excited to be here.
Yeah, so you have quite the interesting career that I imagine a lot of our listeners are a little bit jealous of. But I have a question before you tell us what you do today. Were you a baseball, softball player growing up, or have you just found yourself in love with America's pastime?
Yeah, you caught me. I've been playing, well, I guess now I'm a retired athlete. That's hard for me to take in even probably 6 years later, but I played softball, since it was available with T-ball all the way through college, 4 years of college softball. Always interested in the game of baseball and always wanted to work in baseball because that's where the opportunity was. Didn't realize how different they really were until I got into baseball. And there are quite a few differences. So I've been learning that along the way, but the softball background definitely helps.
Yeah, so tell everyone what you do today working in baseball.
So I work with the New York Mets. I'm a mental performance coach for them in the minor leagues. I've been with them. I'm going into my fourth season now, which is crazy. It feels like it just started yesterday. And I've worked with every level with us. So I started with rookie ball as an intern, became full-time after that, working with high A. And now, working virtually, it's been with every single minor league player in our organization, and working with our taxi squad as well this year. But now I find myself working more so with our AAA and AA players as they make their way to the major leagues.
So during that time of year, where are you based out of? I imagine you do a ton of travel, but where's kind of home for you?
A ton of travel. I find myself in Port St. Lucie, Florida a lot, which is where our minor league facility is. So with our Florida State League down there, you spend a lot of time going across the state of Florida back and forth. I've gotten to know it very well, especially with my time in Tallahassee at Florida State. So I'm kind of excited for travel to start back up again, get myself in New York some and kind of get back to normal life after this past year.
Yeah, and Florida's been a little more normal, I should say, than other places around the country. So I know that's got to be somewhat of an advantage. I'm based in the Dallas area, so Texas, and I've traveled to Florida actually a few times in the last 6 months. So I know that's got to help a little bit because as we talked about, always being on Zoom, anything pops in and it's like, hey, there's no commute, just pile up your, turn on your Zoom and let's rock and roll. What inspired you to go from athlete or quote retired athlete as we all are and at some stage or another to working on the mental performance side? Was there an area that you really struggled in as an athlete and you thought, I just want to figure out why I struggled here and how I can maybe overcome it in life after sports, or was it something different that took you down this path?
Yeah, it's actually really interesting. I had a coach that I think taught me the mental game without knowing he was teaching me the mental game. I was the athlete that was not the most athletic on the field, unfortunately, but I definitely had the mind going at all times. I was the thinker out there. So my coach really honed in on that. And we found that I was able to use the fact that I was kind of in tune with my mind. I had some awareness behind how that could help. And I started applying tools like we do with mental performance. And I saw my athletic performance rise to a level that was allowing me to play as good as athletes that were purely athletic out there. And really, it was what allowed me to get a college scholarship and go play 4 years in college. So because of that, in that experience with learning my mental game, I was like, I want to help other people figure this out. It's no longer just the pure talent that gets us where we want to go and allows us to reach our dreams. We can also work on some things off the field to help with that too.
One of the things you said there I'm curious about is you were very in tune in terms of your brain and how you were processing the game mentally at a go, especially when we're younger. A lot of people, I think, overanalyze too much. Like they're aware of a lot, but then they start overanalyzing so much of the situation. Did you ever find yourself into that state because you were a very cerebral player to overanalyze too much and kind of get caught in that paralysis by analysis? Or were you just kind of naturally tuned in to be a little more self-aware through that process and your coach kind of was able to guide on how to take that upper level?
Yeah, it's such an interesting question, and it's crazy to say no. I was really lucky in the fact that I was able to sort through my thought processes and kind of use them to my benefit without overthinking. And I think that's where it's so interesting when I'm working with athletes that are overthinkers. It's so different between me and them that I kind of have to figure out, okay, what's going to work for you to kind of tune this down a little bit when I'm someone that like really tuned into the thoughts and used those. So it's unique challenges for everybody, but I was one of the lucky ones that the overthinking did not plague me on the field.
And it's interesting that you shared that piece right there, that you have the opportunity to obviously work with people today and working in the Mets organization of people that can overanalyze, because a lot of times we see this on a bigger scale, players that go from the athlete to the coach, and especially if they're an incredibly talented athlete, never understand why other players like just can't do the play. Like, why can't you just do that? It's simple, because they were so athletic. It was so natural for them that other people don't have that same tune. But you have that curiosity factor, which is why I think you've been successful and to continue to grow in your career, of trying to figure out how can I help them become more like how I see it in this sense that comes naturally to me. And curiosity is obviously one of the biggest, I would say, skills or traits to successful people, is constantly looking and learning and trying to figure things out. One of the things about overanalyzing that I tend to look at as someone who hasn't quite struggled, I'm a little more like, let's just let it rip and go, is the idea of maintaining the middle. And you and I had talked about this offline briefly, of when you overanalyze, sometimes we get so stressed out, we're taking in so much, our focus is going every which way. And then we kind of ride that emotional highs and lows of, we kick ourselves when we're down, or we celebrate a little too much when we're up. Baseball is such a long game, such a long season, 162 games, spring training, postseason. Maintaining the middle and being able to kind of control that high and that low is key for a player to have a successful season, because you're all going to go through streaks one way or another, just like we do in life. What are some of the things that you found, or tend to lean on, in terms of helping people create a little more of that baseline, in terms of how do we make sure that our highs are not too high and our lows are not too low, so that we can better perform or better show up?
This is a great conversation, and especially like you said, when we're talking about baseball with such a long season, and oftentimes with minor leagues, it's such a long career as while we're trying to get to our ultimate goal of being in the major leagues. And so I think ultimately what I preach and what I find helps with this is the foundation of mental skills, I think, is self-awareness, and building awareness around our thought processes. Without that, it's really hard to implement the other skills. And then on the other end of the spectrum of that, which is, I think, is the ultimate goal for my athletes, is to have mindfulness. So combining the idea of having the self-awareness and building on that skill to where we get to a place to where we can be aware in the present moment. So for us, when we're playing 162 games in a season, if we're thinking out, if we're time traveling, as I say, so if we're thinking to the future, we're thinking to the past, we're not in that present moment, which makes it really, challenging to not kind of maintain that middle when we're actually in the situation that does lead to the high highs or the low lows. So first step, I think, to get around to it is being present, mindful in the moment.
Is that,
And then
let me ask you real quick. Sorry
yeah.
to jump in there. Just for our listeners, do you classify mindfulness as the ability to be essentially where your feet are, centered in the present moment? Or how would you define that word, so that I make sure that they're on the same
Mhm.
page with you?
Yeah, it's kind of a buzzword right now,
It
right? And
is.
so how I look at it as being able to be in the present moment. But with that, it's being aware of what's going on in our head. It's being aware of how the environment's affecting us and just noticing it, right? So we're not necessarily reacting to what we're noticing. We're just taking it in. And then I think ultimately, because of that mindfulness, because of that presence, we're allowed to adjust where need be, and get back to middle. If we do notice, oh, right now I'm super frustrated with the pitch that just happened before, but I'm going to be mindful. I'm going to get back to the present, and I'm going to let that go.
I love that. Yeah. And so it really, from a batter's perspective, to give a good example to listeners, it would be getting up to the plate. You just swung and missed at something. It's understanding my thoughts, actually actively understanding my thoughts are thinking about the last pitch. I need to control my breathing. I need to focus on what's coming with the upcoming delivery instead of everything else that could be going on, or playing that game of what if I swing and miss again? It's just, how do I bring myself back to this current spot? Almost kind of from a third party perspective, you can almost see yourself. Would you say that's pretty accurate in that sense?
Absolutely. That's a great way to look at it. And I think in listening to you say that, and another nice way to think about it is just checking in, right? It's continuously checking in. So if we just had a bad swing, we step out of that box and we check in. We say, okay, what are we thinking right now? What are we feeling right now? Potentially mentally and physically, right? So maybe we're feeling tension. We need to adjust there. So it's doing a full scan of what's going on physically and mentally with us, and then adjusting where we need to after that.
Let me ask you, because baseball is a game of routines. I would say the athletes have routines. You have your warm up, you know what's happening on home games and away games, you have your schedules, you have all of these things that happen. Mentally, you kind of have a routine and checklist that you're training yourself to go through, that if your attention gets off course, this is how I bring it back. Sometimes in life after sports, we kind of forget the importance of routines. We look at them as just things to go through versus having like a mental checklist that can bring us back to this present moment when we're stressed or when there's so much chaos. And I think the one thing that 2020 taught so many people is the importance of dealing with uncertainty and being mindful of, there's a lot of things outside of your control, but kind of what's my mental checklist internally. How do you kind of help your players start to develop that checklist that brings them back into that moment? Because what I'm hoping is kind of our listeners, and a lot of them former athletes, can hear that and say, okay, so where can I create a checklist in my busy work week or before I walk home and interact with my spouse and kids so that I'm a little more present and mindful in that moment versus being distracted?
Mm-hmm. That's a really good question. And I think where I start with my athletes, especially when I'm just getting to know them, oftentimes I think back to when I first started, the way I wanted to approach this work was solution focused. So I wanted you to come to me with your problem and I wanted to solve the problem for you. That ultimately does not work for anybody listening. There's more to it than that. And part of it is getting to know the athlete. I have to know, their background, where they come from, who they are, how they approach life. And with that, sometimes they know those answers. Sometimes it's us learning together and building awareness around that. But I think it's reflection. It's me constantly asking questions to get that information from them, constantly challenging them to answer those questions themselves. So with reflection, I think we're able to start looking at, where do I want to, we go to this a lot, but where do I want to start doing things? Where do I want to stop doing things? And what do I want to continue doing? And so with reflection, I think people will start to look at, okay, this is something that's really beneficial for me in my life. I want to continue doing that. I heard this idea and I thought this was really cool, that, listening to a podcast on my way home from work was going to allow me kind of to debrief my day and then be present when I get home. And maybe I noticed that going to get, a McDonald's coffee every morning wasn't beneficial for me. So I'm going to stop doing that. And so reflection, noticing what's working, what's helping, and what's not, and then making adjustments after that.
Would you say that's one reason journaling, even if it's a simple like 2-3 bullet points every day, is helpful, because it helps really distill what we're reflecting on or force ourselves to create that awareness and then write it down, which obviously is much more powerful than us trying to remember it in our heads?
Yeah, absolutely. Journaling is it's a funny thing for me because I'm really conscious of who I'm talking to at work, especially, I get in a room and in front of 100 guys and I'm like, I'm going to tell them to start journaling today. What are they going to, how are they going to respond to that? Right. They're going to look at
diary.
me. Yeah, exactly. They're going to be like, Sam, I am not writing a diary for you. But it's, convincing them in all the other ways and maybe thinking of cool ways to not call it journaling. I haven't figured that out completely yet, but it is absolutely writing things down and taking the time to kind of just get out what's in our brain and organize that a little bit can be so helpful. And I think it often surprises people how much actually comes out. And then you really do start building awareness around emotions, feelings, the way those things impact us, and get a little bit more organized in how we approach our days in life too.
I love that. So I'm going to throw an idea out there that popped in my head as you were saying that. Challenge them instead of journaling. It's mental batting practice, mental BP, because you're intentional going in, practicing stuff. You're trying to tweak a hit. You're trying to get warmed up. It's warming up your brain. Maybe that's a crazy idea, but I was like, guys would probably get like my mental BP in the morning to get ready and get going. Throwing that out there.
Absolutely.
Along those lines of journaling, building our self-awareness, recognizing certain behaviors comes down to really our mindset. What mindset are we intentionally building? And one of the things that I love that stuck out when we were kind of going through this before the show is the concept of defining your mindset. Because a lot of times we define maybe who we want to be and maybe some of the skills that they have. And man, I want to be successful, so I need to be better at budgeting money or sales, or we think of it from a physical or a skill set from a corporate standpoint. But a lot of times we never sit down and say, what do I actually want my mindset to be? How do I define how I see the world and how I use my brain? Talk to me a little bit about that concept and what defining your mindset means to you, and really why it's so important that we invest the time to do it.
Yeah, I love this because it's so individualized, and I think sometimes we take away from all of this information that we know in terms of mental performance and mental skills, and we forget that it really needs to be based on the individual. So I call it, in terms of performance, defining your mindset approach. I think it's really, especially with people that aren't so in tune with mental performance and working on their mental skills, we often we'll watch a video, we'll see a documentary, and we'll be like, we're going to start doing that. We're going to be like Kobe. We're going to be like Mike, but really the first step is determining what's going to work specifically for us. And then that's how you start figuring out what tools you're going to use to get to that mindset. So it's looking at your past experiences, your past games. Where did you perform really well? Also taking a look at maybe where you didn't perform really well, and then defining the variables that went into those performances. So I performed really well for this 6-month span. What was going on? What was my approach to the games? What was the emotion that was consistently there? What was the feeling? Was it confidence? Was it calm and relaxation? So using those past performances that went really well to define the mindset that allows us to play at our peak performance, and then use the tools that we have to work towards getting to that mindset approach consistently every game.
I love that. One of the things along those lines that kind of popped up in my head that I'm a little curious about is defining, once we define that mindset, we define kind of how we want to show up when I've done well, when we look at when we struggle, and maybe when we struggle in sports, sometimes it's not necessarily anything we're doing wrong. Sometimes there's things going on outside of the game that influence how we play, that influence our focus, our energy levels, how we're showing up.
Mm-hmm.
One of those things, a lot of times on the reverse side, is players use the game as an escape. It's an escape from troubles and challenges going out. They may be having issues with a girlfriend or a spouse and not handling it well. It's driving it. But when they get on the field, like, they're able to compartmentalize that for a necessary period of time. And I'm curious, in your experience, have you ever seen to where that compartmentalization has gotten to where it's unhealthy, and how we address that? And the reason reason I'm asking is, if someone listening is struggling maybe with grief, they're struggling with something at home, but they find that they can escape when they go to the gym, or they can escape when they get to work, and they can lock in here and compartmentalize it. But once they leave, they're having to deal with it all over again. And for a while, that's okay. But eventually what goes on off the field influences how you show up on the field, and vice versa. And so I'm curious where you start to see the parallel of use this sacred time on the field to focus in, to be present, to not let that distract you. But at some point, how do we know when to address it and stop compartmentalizing it? That's a pretty deep question, but it just kind of popped up as we're talking about like managing our mindset, because that's a lot of times we try to have a mindset for work, a mindset for life, a mindset for friendships. when we're still the same person. We just show up differently in different areas, but they still influence each area.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a really interesting question. I don't know that I've ever thought about it in detail, but what came to mind when I was listening to you ask it was, yeah, oftentimes the players do separate, right? Maybe, and with people at home too, maybe it is the gym time that allows us to get away or have that escape. I think what came to mind for me is that what I noticed that even if they tend to take that, you know, that time for the game where they are present in the moment and they're not paying attention to things that go off the field, what I've seen is that it still changes our approach to the day to day, right? So they know that when we're on the field, we're focusing on the field, but maybe they do have something going on at home. So the way that they're approaching their practices, the way that they're approaching the day to day, even leading up to the game, becomes different. So ultimately, over time, little by little, our mindset approach becomes a little different. And to give an example, I think maybe we're struggling with finances at home. We're questioning if baseball is the right option anymore, for example, and we continue to minimize little increments, put pressure on each situation that we're doing each day. So we start to put a little bit more pressure on that bullpen, a little bit more pressure on the statistics that came out of that game than maybe that we used to, because we're understanding that the results are leading to life decisions.
Yep.
So yeah, you know, did that make sense? Like, because
No,
that's what
it
immediately
does.
came to mind.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I think that's a beautiful example. So at which point do we start to release, like, and how do we manage that piece? Because yeah, if you go into, you know, putting more and more pressure on every ground ball and every, you know, you're eventually going to have the yips. Like at some point, there's going to be that disconnect because you're putting so much pressure on that one play, and it's got to be perfect. Because if it's not perfect, then your career's over, and you got to do something else. You don't know what you're going to do, and blah blah. You know, you just let it snowpile. How do we help manage that pressure that we're incrementally putting on ourselves? Does that all go all the way back to what we talked about earlier in terms of building that self awareness and journaling, and then obviously talking to someone about it?
Yeah, I think it's using as many tools as we can. And that's the $1 million question, right? I wish I had the answer.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, I think it's different for everyone. What works is a different answer for everybody. I think it's putting in all the skills, like you said. And it's also coming to terms and really defining our identity. That's not something that I tuned into too much actually until this past year. I've really started thinking more and more about what it is to, you know, define identity, and really the differences between players that their whole identity is in baseball versus the players that have, you know, the identity of baseball player, but also the identity of father, the identity of husband, and really tuning into the fact that they're not just a baseball player. And I think with coming to understand who you are and what your identity is can release some pressure on the various identities, right? So even if the pressure is right now on the fact that I'm a husband and I need to make money, there's still the identity of baseball player that we can't ignore.
Do you think, and this may be a 90 something mile an hour slider coming at you, so I apologize in advance. Do you think we should define and work on solidifying our identity first, or building our mindset and defining our mindset?
Really good question. And my favorite answer is going to be it depends, right? It's going to depend on the guy that's in front of you. And I hate giving you that
Yep.
curveball right back, but I think it's because what's going to work for each person is going to be different, right? And it's about buy-in too. If I have a guy that's willing to work with me on identity and that's kind of where we want to start first, then that's where I want to approach it first with him. What I found is absolutely starting with the mental performance in terms of building the awareness, gaining some understanding of our thought processes and the way these things affect our life tend to help a little bit with the identity piece.
Yeah, and I love the fact that you also said use all available tools too. So for anyone listening, there's a lot of parallels to the discussion we're having around ball players and what you may be going through, and the importance of what your solution is may be different than someone else's, but find every available solution. And most importantly, don't be afraid to ask for help. Like great players are
Mhm.
not stubborn in the fact that they don't need help. They have hitting coaches, they have managers, they have mental performance coaches. Like they understand that competitive edge is needed. They can't do it alone. And there's not a successful person out there that can do it. And a lot of times we can let our pride of like, I'm not talking to anybody about my mental game. I don't, need this. I'm going to be Kobe. I'm going to have Mamba mentality. You still need that help to build that self-awareness, to make sure your identity is solidified and it's not just tied to one thing that you do, in order to have that well-rounded experience, and more importantly to show up more confidently and strong in what you're doing so you can make a better impact. So many things that you shared here today, Samantha, were awesome for listeners today. Where can people learn more about and just follow along your work throughout the season with the Mets this upcoming year? Because y'all have been making quite a big moves at the major league level. And so I know they're a team to watch, but where can we follow along your career and work? Because I know you're still early on getting started and continuing to make a name in the space. As our mutual friend Lauren Nicole Johnson, former guest, recommended we connect, and which is why you're here today hanging out with us.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'll champion my team, keep up with the Mets for sure. I think we're going to be somebody to watch this season and moving forward for years to come. I'm not too big on the social media aspect. That's where I try to keep my work-life balance a little bit. So I tend to keep that personal, but just keep up with the Mets. I'm sure you'll see some great stuff out there. And then I'm also on LinkedIn, so you can connect with me there if you'd like.
Absolutely love it. Sam, thank you so much for hanging out on the show this week. I appreciate it.